Good afternoon. Welcome to the Henry L. Stimson Center. My name is Andrea Koppel. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees here. And until last June, when I quit to become a full-time mom, I was the Vice President of Global Engagement and Policy at Mercy Corps, which works in over 40 countries around the world, mostly conflict-affected, fragile states, which are the unfortunate home to many of these child soldiers, whether they're South Sudan, Iraq, Syria, and Nigeria, all of them countries in which government forces and or armed groups continue to recruit thousands of children to participate in violent conflicts. This despite the fact, as we'll hear from many of our panelists, that it's in direct violation of international humanitarian law, including additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions prohibiting the recruitment of children under the age of 18 into armed conflict. This is a topic of great interest to the scholars here at the Stimson Center as we continue to seek to find effective policy solutions to end this abomination. In October, we hosted the UN Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, Virginia Gamba, in order to highlight the multitude of issues surrounding the impact of war and armed conflict on children. And in the months to come, Stimson will examine the drivers behind the recruitment of child soldiers and will try to identify the ways in which these circumstances can be mitigated to give children the opportunity to live better lives. Today, however, the focus of this event is a decision that was made in March of 2017, almost 1 year ago, when the Canadian government became the first country to issue guidance to its military service members to prepare them for the realities of confronting armed children on the battlefield. Now, to help us talk through all of the angles, we are truly fortunate to have General Roméo Dallaire and the Executive Director of the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative, Shelly Whitman, with us. We're also joined by Colonel Dwight Raymond from the U.S. Army War College's Peacekeeping Stability Operations Initiative, and Joe Becker from the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Rachel Stohl, who directs our Conventional Defense Program, and she'll give some opening remarks and will also be our moderator today. Rachel?
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, all of you, for braving. It doesn't seem like it's bad weather now, but apparently it's going to be horrific when we all leave. So I appreciate you braving the weather and coming out this afternoon for what I know will be a very interesting and informative conversation. And of course, thank you to Andrea for that very warm welcome to the Stimson Center. We're very fortunate to have such an active and well-informed board of directors here at Stimson. As Andrea said, I manage the Conventional Defense Project here at Stimson, and we look at a breadth of issues related to the international arms trade, including how the arms trade impacts children in armed conflict. And so, as Andrea mentioned, this is a continuation of a long conversation that we've been having for many decades about the use of children in conflict. And we all know that conflicts threaten the lives and livelihoods of children around the world. And at Stimson, we've often focused on one particular consequence of armed conflict that affects children, and that is the recruitment and use of child soldiers. And that's really what we're focusing on this afternoon in looking at ways in which we can prevent and stop the recruitment and use of child soldiers and address the impact of child soldiers that occurs around the world. There are often tremendous consequences for those U.S. soldiers or foreign soldiers that confront children in their operations. Sergeant Nathan Chapman, the first U.S. military service member killed in Afghanistan in 2002, was reportedly killed by a 14-year-old child soldier. And surviving soldiers must often confront and deal with the psychological trauma that they experience of confronting children on the battlefield. I think for this afternoon, as we're thinking about the ways in which we can prevent and stop the use of child soldiers, we need to think about a holistic and comprehensive approach. Many of the trainings and work that has been done in this country on the use of child soldiers has been done in a very ad hoc way. And so I hope we can think about ways in which we can institutionalize confronting child soldiers on the battlefield in a way that protects not only children in these conflicts, but our servicemen and women as well. And I'm really, truly honored and grateful to have such a distinguished panel join us today to discuss all of these important issues. As Andrea said, she gave brief introductions, and many of these panelists are well known to those of you who work in this field. But of course, we'll start with General Roméo Dallaire, who's founder of the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative, which seeks to end the recruitment and use of child soldiers worldwide. Many of you may know that General Dallaire served as the force commander of the United Nations in Rwanda and has experience firsthand with these issues. To his left is Shelly Whitman, who's the executive director of the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative. To my far right, we have Colonel Dwight Raymond, who's a peace operations specialist at the U.S. Army War College's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. He's the primary author of several doctrinal publications regarding peace and stability operations, including the U.S. Army Manual on the Protection of Civilians and the U.S. military's joint publication on peace operations. And then my old friend Joe Becker is to my right, who's the advocacy director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. And Joe served as the founding chairperson of the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers and successfully helped establish an international treaty banning the forced recruitment of children under 18. There are more complete bios in the back of the room if you are interested. And so I want to start today by thinking about, as we turn to sort of the specifics of the issues, that we're talking about a problem that affects tens of thousands of children in conflicts and countries around the world. It's not unique to one region. We're currently seeing increases of child soldier use in places like Yemen and Syria and Iraq as these conflicts continue to perpetuate and wage. This is not just a problem of armed groups, but these are children that are found in government forces as well, in militias, other armed groups. They fill a variety of combat and combat support roles. So we're not talking about just the child who has a gun pointed at you, but children involved in conflict in a variety of ways. And so what I'd like is we hear from our panelists today to think about, as the United States expands its footprint in conflict zones around the world, U.S. soldiers may come into increasing contact with child soldiers. And it's not a new challenge. It's something that U.S. servicemen and women have had to deal with for many, many years. But as governments continue to struggle to stop the use of child soldiers in some of the world's most brutal conflicts, what opportunities does that give us to address the operational and long-term effects arising from this engagement? So I'm hoping we can reframe the conversation a little bit today and how we can think about training our militaries and our leaders on efforts to address and stop the proliferation of the use of child soldiers, and also the inefficiencies and the risks that those that are using child soldiers confront. So starting with that frame, because I've spoken too long, starting with that frame, I want to turn to General Dallaire and Shelly Whitman to discuss this issue from their perspective. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in the ether. And we are very, very proud to be invited to speak to you today on a subject that has become the main focus of my life, and to which Dr. Whitman is the executive director and the implementer and the intellectual dominant force behind the solving of this. And so I'm going to simply, as the founder, give you a few words of why I'm interested in it, and then ask Shelly to give you the nuts and bolts of how we've actually been able to move a country like Canada in its foreign policy and its defense policy, and ultimately that has made its way down to actually training and doctrine for implementation, as Canada goes back into peacekeeping in a fairly short term. Because I'm a retired general and a retired senator, I've been recommended that I read from notes and not be verbose as I would by simply extrapolating a lot of words. And so I'm going to read a bit from, if you don't mind, from the text and hand it as soon as I can to Shelly, who really will give that whole essence of how we move the yardsticks in regards to the threat of child soldiers and the use of them around the world. I'm coming to you, yes, as a retired general and but a former force commander who was in conflict and ultimately not only a civil war but a genocide in which child soldiers were extensively used by all sides. And as a senator was involved with the defense policies and also veterans policies, which brings us to the psychological impact of facing children and how to handle the moral dilemmas and ethical dilemmas that come from that, let alone meeting your challenges as in combat. A humanitarian, but also an apprentice grandfather, so I've got a bit of a stake in this whole thing. My background comes from the fact that I lived the experience of having a gun stuck up my nostril with a 13, 14-year-old sweating and big eyes and actually finger on the trigger and the total inability to anticipate what a child will do in such a circumstance and what will motivate them. It could be a noise or whatever versus an adult, and the vulnerability that we face in facing that type of combatant, that type of situation. And that was not just once, that's the uniqueness is not there anymore. It is prevalent, and it is prevalent in regards to the use of children as weapons of war. And in so doing, it is, in my opinion, a threat to which we are often simply not trained or prepared to handle. And because of that, we require more knowledge and more specific skill sets in order to be operationally effective, in order to reduce ultimately the use of children, the recruitment to start with, and the use of children. That is to say, how do we make them less effective by making our forces more effective in countering that threat? So we're in the front end of the problem and not in the rehabilitation, reintegration part of the exercise. All the conflicts out there, and they've been since the end of the Cold War, and they're ongoing now, and it looks like for a while yet until we're able to actually treat this threat and ultimately change the nature of the use of children in conflict and not use them, in fact, in conflict. All conflicts have children, child soldiers, boys and girls, up to 40% of them are girls, used in a spectrum of employment in conflicts. And so every one of us who gets deployed now will see and face the effect of children in armed conflict. And certainly in Rwanda, it was children on both sides, both the government side, who, by the by, started as simply a youth movement that was changed into a militia, and ultimately the Interahamwe were the ones who slaughtered the 800,000 by machete, as you were able to maneuver thousands of young youths, boys and girls, to actually go to extremes of, in fact, use of force like of that nature. There isn't, I don't think, the possibility of avoiding this threat in any of the conflicts. And what I'm trying to get at is that this is an operational dimension of conflict that we must face operationally. And so we need the capabilities to meet this demanding threat, which is not only, as was indicated, not only the gun-to-gun scenario, but the spectrum of use of children in the support roles throughout, and the fact that they are so prevalent, so numerous, and so able to sustain much of the conflicts because of the scale that they represent on the ground. And so the effective training of peacekeepers and of not only soldiers but police forces, because we do train both. We're into security sector actors and not purely military, because both are working together, and part of it is trying to get them to work together too, in facing this threat, that if not trained, and if it's a surprise is one of the principles of war, but you want to surprise the enemy, not you be surprised, is that the fact that we end up either overreacting, underreacting, or simply not reacting at all. And that all gives advantage to the person who's using the child soldiers. Ergo, they're winning by using them, and not necessarily having to use extreme force on their side, because of our reaction sometimes to simply give ground and give up and back off, and that gives that extraordinary advantage to them. I think that children being used intentionally and systematically across the world in all forms of conflict, whether it be armed groups or state forces, which still there are 7 who are using them, or violent extremists that are using, and we want to work on the prevention of violent extremism. It is ever more critical that we look at preventing the recruitment and the use of children in conflict versus simply stating the fact that they're there and that how will we ultimately resolve the conflict. What we want to do is get into the front end and actually prevent them being recruited in the first place, which can take away a significant operational capability on those who use them. In South Sudan, they're used massively, and every one of those generals, of which they got lots of them, is able to mobilize rapidly a lot of children to be able to be used in such a place. And so, in order to provide mission success, in my opinion, it is essential that we look at not only how to prevent the use of children and how to make them ineffective on the ground, but how do we prevent them from being re-recruited and being remobilized and continuing the conflict and turning into, in fact, problems in the nation as it tries to reconstitute itself. And so with that element, when we face them, we face that moral and ethical dilemma that is, in fact, creating and causing a significant number, in our opinion, of casualties on our own side. We are taking a lot of casualties due to the operational stress injury that these moral dilemmas create, and ultimately through PTSD, of which I myself was medically released from the forces because of that, but particularly where the troops at all levels face children, face that dilemma, and there seems to be no winning in it. And in so doing, they psychologically pay a horrible price. The sergeant recently came to me who'd done 5 tours, and he'd been back for 4.5 years, who told me that he hadn't hugged his children in those 4.5 years because of the fact that he had to engage and use lethal force against children in the time in Afghanistan. And so, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world deserve to be protected and not become the primary, in many cases, but certainly a main effective weapon of war. It is not for children to fight adult wars, and it's certainly not them to be one of those operationally effective weapon systems out there that are sustaining wars, because it is my humble opinion that, in fact, child soldiers will not win a war, a conflict, but because of what you can do in a limited way, but with the scale, you can sustain war. So how many generational scenarios are we going to face by children being used as weapons of war? So I've gone beyond my time, and I would like to turn to Shelly and Dr. Whitman to see how we were able to move not only our program, but also to influence Canada, and how we hope to continue to advance that through some of the initiatives that we were able to successfully pull off, particularly in this last year. So please, Shelly.
Thank you.
That's appreciated. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for having us here today, Rachel, and to the Stimson Center. Great pleasure to be able to speak to all of you here because we do believe it's extremely important that the United States government and the military get on board to helping with addressing this issue on a global scale. If we don't have the support of the Americans in this global fight, then we're missing key opportunities where we could actually effectively address this. And so in what I want to just convey to all of you today is that there is a possibility, we sincerely believe, in how we could do this with the U.S. military, with the government. And to be quite crass, we can do it also in their self-interest. This is a humanitarian issue, but it is also a security concern, as General Dallaire highlighted. It is something that impacts children around the world, but it also impacts children here in the United States, as it does children in Canada. We are having young people radicalized, recruited, used for violence. These are not disconnected from the conflicts in which we are seeing children being used and recruited around the world. And there are deep connections to trafficking, child labor, etc. So in our work with the Canadian government, I was highlighting earlier this morning that what's been very important, though, has been the fact that we've conducted an awful lot of research and work and created a lot of pedagogical tools that have led us to be able to demonstrate what is it that was missing within the Canadian Armed Forces for their doctrine, their policy, their defense policy, and the ways forward on this issue, and that they could take a leadership issue on this particular matter, especially understanding politically that this government wants to be seen as a credible player within the United Nations system, and the United Nations needs assistance in achieving its mandate on this issue. I want to make it clear, though, that addressing the use of child soldiers people have to stop thinking of it as just a sideline issue. This is so important to ending conflict around the world that if we don't address it, we're never going to get ahead of many of the conflicts that we're currently trying to address. South Sudan is a great example, and how much money has the United States government poured into a country like South Sudan? And we've just seen cycles and cycles of recruitment and use of child soldiers. Syria will be the same, if not worse. And so when we're talking about this, there's also a dollars and cents approach that we have to understand. How much money are you willing to keep spending into countries that are continuously recruiting and using children, and ones in which you may be working alongside forces who are also using child soldiers? Over the past year, we have worked really hard with the Government of Canada to have them sign the Safe Schools Declaration. And the Safe Schools Declaration is looking at how do we protect education from being under attack during armed conflict. But that meant we had to demonstrate through the creation of toolkits to the Judge Advocate Generals and the Canadian Armed Forces what it meant. What were we asking them to do by doing this? And one of the key things that will often happen when you're working with militaries around the world is they want to make sure that you're not constraining them. You're not tying their hands behind their back, preventing them from doing other actions. And so it's really important that when you're addressing this, you have to understand rules of engagement, standard operating procedures, the realities on the ground. And our work is premised on that fact, that we understand those realities. And what we want to do is improve the interactions between soldiers and children in armed conflict contexts so that we're better protecting the soldier as well as the child. In that, our work is practical. We work through scenarios. We do a lot of attempts to understand if the knowledge you've learned in the classroom has actually translated into action. If it hasn't, then you have failed. And so while I am appreciative of so many efforts by many to do work from an international legal perspective to get information and awareness out, We have to go beyond that now. Now we've got to make sure that that gets translated into action on the ground, which takes away the tactical and strategic advantages that those who currently use child soldiers have, because we are not adequately prepared for those scenarios. And so we need to take that demand out of the equation if we're going to really have the potential to prevent the use of children around the world. And in that, we have to understand how do we change attitudes and behaviors on this issue, both from within our forces as well as with the forces that we may be dealing with around the world. We pride ourselves on doing things like creating national level memorandums of understandings with forces around the world, and to work over a long-term period to try to change practice, attitudes, and behaviors. With the Canadian government, we assisted with creation of the doctrine that Rachel was alluding to as well. The Canadian Armed Forces now have a doctrine on child soldiers, which is a good premise for others to look at. We have been working just now with Sierra Leone, who have just passed through their first doctrine on child soldiers as well through Parliament. So as we did this, we were also working with our Minister of Defense, and the defense policy specifically mentions this as a key issue for the Canadian government. And that led to us working with the Canadian government on what was called the Vancouver Principles on the prevention of the recruitment and use of child soldiers in peacekeeping operations, which got launched in November of this year. We see all of these points as culminating in an effort where we hope that Canada is going to take the lead within NATO and its allies and other forces to continue to advocate for preventing the recruitment and use of children. But that means that all of the countries that sign on and at a national level have to take on their own onus in this issue, which means preparation, training, doctrine creation in that regard. My last point on this that I would just like to talk about is that when it comes to the United States is a big supporter of bilateral arrangements and training with many countries around the world. There's an opportunity to understand that if the United States could take this as an issue which they are trained on and prepared for, it could go a long way in trying to understand or to reduce its use in other areas where these are major issues, where we may not be able to get in on the ground to assist directly, but through their assistance to those particular forces, this could be one of the issues that could be very important for them to address. Currently, however, if you don't have doctrine and training that addresses it, there's a gap that exists that means that you're continuing to put your soldiers at harm's length, as well as continuing to not find a way to effectively address that conflict that you are currently in. So I thank you very much, and I will end it at this point.
Thank you. I think listening to both General Dallaire and Dr. Whitman, it is impressive. It is astounding how much you've been able to sort of create and generate not only within the government of Canada, but also around the world. And I think it's worth noting that it didn't just happen in 1 year. The culmination might have been in a 1 year period, but it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes sustained and consistent effort, and it takes buy-in. It takes buy-in from your political leaders, it takes buy-in from your military, and it is a sustained process. And finding those champions, I think, has been a key to not only your success, but perhaps something that the U.S. can think about in terms of identifying ways to address this issue in less of an ad hoc way and more in a holistic and comprehensive way. I think that's a good transition to Colonel Dwight Raymond. So I welcome your thoughts about how the U.S. has approached this issue in some contexts and ways, potential ways forward. So thank you and
Thanks,
welcome.
Rachel. To the extent that an issue like child soldiers can be categorized cleanly in a neat bin, which is impossible to do, but in an effort to try to do that, we kind of put child soldiers underneath the topic of child protection or protection of children or children in armed conflict. And we tend to have that underneath a broader category of protection of civilians. And Now, whereas a lot of the protection of civilians doctrine that we've developed over the past couple of years has been mostly focused on some other issues, specifically civilian casualty mitigation, mass atrocity response operations, and conflict-related sexual violence. If you wanted to pick a sort of a top three, child protection would be maybe, if not as prominent as those other three, certainly up there in the forefront of some of the issues that we tried to address. So I'm going to reference kind of three publications that we've been involved in. The first one being an Army manual on the protection of civilians, which was published in October of 2015. The second one being what we call a joint military, a joint publication for all U.S. military forces, not just the Army. And there's an appendix on the protection of civilians in the new joint publication on peace operations, which is being published this month. It uses the same framework as we use in the Army manual, but written a little bit differently. And then there's a reference guide that our organization, PCASOI, the Peacekeeping Stability Operations Institute, has just revised and published, which goes into a lot more detail on the topic of the protection of civilians. But all three of these publications kind of use the same general framework. So within in the POC guide, and the intent was for a military commander or a member of a military staff that's tasked to protect civilians. Okay, and I think like Shelly kind of mentioned, it's nice to have the legal framework and all that, the theoretical stuff, but what does it really mean on the ground? Okay, I know, I get it, I want to protect civilians. What does it mean that I have to actually do? So we tried to break that down, and in the guide, we kind of identified 45 tasks that apply to the protection of civilians, we think, in most cases, maybe not every case, but generally speaking. One of those tasks specifically being the protection of children, and within that is where we kind of have much of our discussion on the issue of child soldiers. But I think child soldiers is a topic like many that on the one hand you could focus on it as a distinct area, but it's also something that needs to be mainstreamed elsewhere. So, I think we try to do that. So in these other 45 tasks, and I'll just kind of discuss them to a certain degree, and you can kind of, I think, see where the child soldiers issue would sort of fall in this mainstreaming type of approach. So in all three of our frameworks, we have three fundamentals, both in the Army, in the Joint, and in our guide. First fundamental being understanding civilian risks. The second fundamental being protecting civilians during operations. And the third fundamental being shaping a protective environment. And so the different tasks that we have kind of get grouped under those different fundamentals. So the first one, the understanding of the civilian risks, what this entails, and you can kind of sort of infer where, how child soldiers might fit under a lot of these areas. But understanding the operational environment, what are the political circumstances, the economic circumstances, the social circumstances, and a child soldier's lens or child protection lens would fit into that. Understanding the actors, who are the adversaries, who are the ones who are targeting children, who are the ones who are the third-party enablers, if you will, that may not be directly involved in recruiting child soldiers, but are enabling or financing those who are. What are the vulnerabilities and threats and threats to children we think are something that is pretty much a standing threat across pretty much all contexts, whether you're looking at a mass atrocity situation, whether you're looking at an armed conflict, an area, a area where there's just a lot of violent instability. Also important to understanding the civilian risks are the intelligence activities that you have to conduct, how you go about prioritizing the information that you want to bring in, synthesizing it, analyzing it, disseminating it, and not just from own sources, but multi-source information, because a lot of times non-military organizations like NGOs or host state organizations might have the best information about child soldiers or any other related issues. And then the final thing that needs to be done in this category is conducting assessments and how you come up with a credible, a realistic, and not overly burdensome assessment framework that you can kind of base your judgments on. So the second fundamental, protecting civilians during operations. One of the tasks under this fundamental is to protect children. But many of the other tasks, I think, are also tasks that lends themselves to having a child protection or child soldiers lens fit underneath it. The planning, and in the Canadians' joint doctrine note, this is a very important part of emphasis, is the planning of operations with a view towards accounting for child soldiers, preparing how you conduct patrols, what are patrols looking for, and you may send out a patrol that's job is not to specifically look for child soldiers, but any patrol, any movement can also have the added task of, oh, by the way, while you're doing whatever it is that you're doing, you can report on information that might indicate something with respect to child soldiers. Cordon search operations, which might be affected if the target area potentially includes child soldiers there. Neutralizing and defeating perpetrators, securing vulnerable civilians. One of the big tasks, and I mentioned early on that one of the main reasons behind our protection of civilians doctrine is the concern about mitigating civilian casualties. Well, this takes on added emphasis when you're talking about situations where child soldiers might be involved. Responding to incidents of civilian harm, another one where if there's a child soldier dimension to it, that gets becomes a consideration. Something as simple as administration and logistics. One of the requirements if you capture child soldiers is they have to be treated separately. They can't be kept housed in the same facility as normal combatants. So that requirement itself connotes a administrative and logistical burden that if you don't think about it beforehand, if you don't know that that exists, then you're going to be surprised when all of a sudden you have dozens and dozens of child soldier captives, and you're supposed to be disposing of them differently and separately from the regular combatants. Providing relief for displaced persons. It's displaced people show up at camps, and trying to categorize, well, what group do they come from? What group do they fit in? If they're child soldiers or former child soldiers, that becomes an important factor, and so forth. And then the final fundamental being shaping a protective environment. And I think these issues apply both in the preventive sense, to prevent child soldiers from even happening, but then also in a restorative sense, after a situation where we have had child soldiers. And the Canadian Doctrine Note talks about the importance of preventing child soldiers from being re-exploited. And because, and General Dallaire earlier was mentioning about how, former child soldiers can be very valuable recruits for an organization, not necessarily in that country, but in an adjacent country, because they have experience and, it's almost like a soldier fortune kind of situation. But both in a preventive sense and in a restorative sense, many of these issues for shaping a protective environment have relevance to the child soldiers. Conducting information activities, engaging the population and local leaders, coordinating with other actors, especially NGOs and humanitarian organizations and international organizations like, say, UNICEF in certain situations. Contributing to a safe, secure environment, establishing a good governance and the rule of law, providing for social well-being. Presumably that would include schools, where if you have schools that kids can go to schools, they don't necessarily need to find themselves as child soldiers. And a couple of other issues that the Canadian Doctrine note also mentioned, but security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. SSR and DDR, both of those are critical tasks in most conflict situations, and they have a child soldier dimension. I'd add to those two a third one, transitional justice. And transitional justice also often talks about restorative measures to try to look ahead to the future, not necessarily just retributive measures, but a transitional justice program in many countries kind of may have to factor, how do we handle child soldiers who have done some atrocious things in the past? And you look at stories of the LRA, people who have been kidnapped by the LRA and forced to do terrible things. And then finally, community building is another area that is important for protection of civilians in general, but for the resettlement of child soldiers, for preventing people from becoming child soldiers, it becomes a task there. So that essentially is our U.S. military approach on, again, the broader topic of the protection of civilians, of which child soldiers is kind of viewed as one of many, many elements of it. But I think the framework that we have, if you wanted to take it and apply it to child soldiers, it kind of fits. And certainly the framework and the elements of the framework need to have child soldiers incorporated in all of the different steps that it has. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Raymond. I think there were a lot of very interesting points that you raised in your presentation, but I think the coordination with NGOs, that sometimes NGOs know more what's happening on the ground, they see more, they're dealing with the impacts of the use of child soldiers firsthand, and often share that information, provide it to governments on the ground there, governments at home that are providing assistance or that are involved in peacekeeping operations is crucial. And I think having Joe Becker on the panel allows us to get that insight. NGOs have been at the forefront of this fight to stop the use of child soldiers for many decades and have been instrumental in this country in pushing the U.S. government to go further, I think, often than it's comfortable with. I think have been instrumental in pushing the U.S. to adopt legislation like the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which I know Joe will talk about, much more so than maybe the U.S. government would focus on based on the variety of priority items, all of the different agendas that are ongoing. And so it's often up to NGOs to continue to push governments a little faster, a little harder than they would get on their own. So I welcome Joe to our panel and to share her insights and experiences as well.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to the Stimson Center for convening this really important discussion and for bringing General Dallaire and Shelly into the conversation to share with us the work that you do with security sectors internationally and also how you've been able to influence the Canadian government to show real leadership on this issue. I thought I would address three different elements that I think influence how the U.S. engages with this issue and the tools that we have at our disposal to address child soldiers. One is simply U.S. deployment policy. And I raise this because up until 2003, the U.S. Armed Forces had a policy of not only recruiting 17-year-olds into its armed forces, but deploying them into war and into hostilities. But after the U.S. ratified the Child Soldiers Protocol, the international treaty that bans the use of children, all four branches of the armed forces issued new regulations stating that 17-year-olds would no longer be deployed into hostilities. And this is significant because, to our knowledge, this was the first time that the U.S. Armed Forces had ever changed their existing practices to support a new international norm. And it's important because it means that the U.S. not only can set a positive example with its own deployment policies worldwide, but when engaging with other security forces, it enables the U.S. to say, we felt that the issue of child soldiers was important enough to change long-standing practice of our own military, and it should be important enough for you too. So that was the first thing I wanted to raise. The second one is the Child Soldiers Prevention Act that Rachel mentioned. This is a groundbreaking piece of law that the U.S. adopted in 2008. The U.S. is virtually unique in the world in having a law of this type. And it is intended to encourage U.S. military allies to adhere to international standards on child soldiers. It basically says that absent a presidential waiver, countries that use or recruit child soldiers are not eligible for certain forms of U.S. military assistance. Foreign military financing, excess defense articles, commercial military sales, international military education and training. Rachel's the one who has in her head all of the different programs that are affected. And there are other governments who, they may not care about international criticism, they may not care about criticism from the UN Security Council, but they do care when it means that their forces aren't going to get the training or the weapons or the military finance that they want. Now, maybe Rachel will discuss this more. We haven't been entirely happy with how the U.S. has implemented this law. The fact of the matter is that there's been far too many waivers that have allowed governments that have been enlisted to continue receiving military assistance even when they've done little to nothing to address the use of child soldiers. But we do have some real success stories that I think illustrate how important this law can be. One of them is Congo. So in the 1990s, Congo had at least 30,000 children fighting on all sides of the armed conflict, one of the highest proportions of child soldiers in the world. And the government forces were perpetrators for decades, recruiting and using children in their own forces. Now in the Congo has been on the list from 2010 when the U.S. State Department first started listing governments for using their child soldiers. And in 2011, the U.S. announced that it would withhold military financing, foreign military financing from Congo because of its child soldier use. And then the following year, it announced that it would no longer train a Congolese battalion because of its child soldier use. Now, at that point, the United Nations had been trying for 7 years to get the Congolese government to sign an action plan to end their use of child soldiers. But after the U.S. made that announcement, it took the Congolese government 5 days to sign that plan. And the success is that in the last 2 years, there have been no new documented cases of child recruitment by the Congolese army. And just a few months ago, the United Nations took Congo off of its list of perpetrators for using child soldiers. Another example is Rwanda. A number of years ago, it became clear that Rwanda, the government, was supporting an armed group operating in the eastern part of Congo called the M23. And the M23 was known for brutal abuses against civilians and widespread recruitment of child soldiers. When the U.S. and other governments announced to Rwanda that they were cutting off their aid because of Rwanda's support of the M23, Rwanda communicated that and broke off its support for the M23. And within a fairly short period of time, the M23 basically disbanded and laid down its arms. The Child Soldiers Prevention Act has also been instrumental in getting Chad to implement an action plan and to take steps to end its use of child soldiers as well. So, this gives sort of a sample of how influential this law can be. And I think many of us believe that it can be even more successful if fully implemented and if the administration would use all of the potential that it has. And then the third thing is that the United Nations does have a very robust children in armed conflict agenda. And as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the United States has been a real important player in building this agenda and using the influence that the United Nations has to try and get both governments and non-state actors to end the use of child soldiers. So, and this is an agenda that's very unique in the UN system, and it has several different components. One is that the UN has a global system for monitoring and reporting on child recruitment and other violations against children. And that's operational in about 15 countries worldwide, where the UN is constantly collecting data and cases of child recruitment. The second thing is that this data is used for an annual list that is issued every year by the UN Secretary General. And it's currently has about 60 names on it. And this includes both governments and non-governmental armed groups that are recruiting child soldiers or committing other violations against children. This is a powerful list, and we call it the list of shame because nobody wants to be on it. If you're on this list, it does not look good. The third element is that if you're on this list, the Security Council has said there's a real possibility of sanctions. You could be subject to arms embargoes, travel bans, asset freezes, and so it's to your benefit to get off the list. And that raises the last element, which is once you're on the list, the only way to get off is to sign an action plan with the UN. And the action plan includes the concrete steps that you're going to take to prevent child recruitment, to identify children in your forces, to demobilize them, to hold perpetrators accountable, and basically resolve the issue. Now, to date, there are almost 30 governments and non-state actors that have signed these action plans. And in fact, almost every government that is on the list has signed such an action plan. The only one that hasn't is Syria. And another surprising factor is that actually the majority of groups that have signed these action plans are non-state actors. So for example, in 2016, there were over 5,000 children that were demobilized from armed groups in the Central African Republic and in the Philippines, in part because of the commitments that they had made to the UN. Now, the way this relates to the United States is that, the U.S. is really in a position to bolster the implementation of these plans and really coordinate with the UN in country in places where governments have signed plans or where they're trying to negotiate plans. So just as one example, I was in touch with the UN team in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the countries that has signed an action plan. And they were able to identify any number of ways in which they felt that the U.S. could be helpful to them. So, for example, helping Afghan troops doing age verification for new recruits, helping to build the capacity of the Afghan forces to do proper screening of their troops, helping to ensure, as Dwight mentioned, when child soldiers are apprehended from the Taliban or from other groups, that they're treated properly and that they're not thrown in detention as an automatic response. And referring allegations of child recruitment and other violations to the UN so that they can monitor and document and include it in their database. So, I think, the point that I want to make here is that we have multiple points of leverage. And, in her introduction, Rachel mentioned that we need a comprehensive response to the use of child soldiers. And over the past number of years, there have been a number of responses that have emerged that we can use. The U.S.'s own deployment practices, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, the UN agenda, and the challenge is simply to use each of these tools to their maximum potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I think as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, wow, we do have a lot of tools at our disposal, and we don't have to think one tool is going to solve the entire spectrum of issues related to the use of child soldiers. But we can use these tools in a very smart way to push different leverage points and to make an impact and inroads on areas that are particularly salient to that particular audience. And I think listening to the four of you gives me great hope that we do have a lot of tools at our disposal, and we just need people to listen, to sit down, to begin that dialogue. This obviously is a great first step, but to reach out to those in positions of power, in positions of policy making, in positions of doctrine writing that can utilize these tools and not have to reinvent the wheel for every single situation. Yes, each conflict is different. I know General Dallaire has once said, if a government says to you, well, we have to use child soldiers or we can't win the war, and your answer is, we've already lost.
That's right. if you got to depend on children to be able to think you're going to win the war, because they won't win the war for you, they'll just keep it going, then you've lost the war. And the aim is, in fact, to work to make that body, operational body, which are the child soldiers, to make them ineffective, to make them not a useful instrument of war. And the best way that we've been able to discern how to pull that off is by, in fact, making the forces that face them more effective in rendering the children less useful without necessarily killing them. Because there's no doctrine out there that ultimately has a magic wand, and there is always that potential of going to use lethal force, either in self-defense or simply as part of your operational concept of not trying to de-escalate something, but in fact trying to eliminate a threat. And a use of lethal force against children, to me, is not the way how you stop the use of child soldiers. And certainly not if you're trying to establish a moral presence, let alone an ethical one. Even though it could be legal, it could be certainly questioned morally, and that will put you in a very difficult position with the people of that country if you keep blowing away children because you think that's the way you're going to solve the conflict.
Absolutely. I think looking at the time, I want to ensure, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I think it would be interesting and helpful for the next 20 minutes or so to allow questions from all of you. And those watching at home, I'm sorry we can't get your questions in. But we have mics here. If you could just identify yourself. We'll come over here first in the green dress, and then perhaps in front, and then over here to the...
Thanks. I'm Jackie O'Neill with Inclusive Security. Thanks for a great talk. Two quick questions. One is, has the U.S. signed on to the Vancouver Principles, and if not, what reason do they give for not doing so? And secondly, I'm struck by the comparisons and the similarities between advocacy around child soldiers and advocacy in our field, which is women, peace, and security. And there are a number of us in this room who focus on the inclusion of women in peace processes and security processes. One of the things we do is try to advocate for more inclusive security forces, and ideally get to what you've accomplished, which is having U.S. security assistance be conditional on our partner nations, including more women in their security forces. We're not there yet, but I'd love to hear your arguments, having thought and researched and studied this. What impact does it have on the use of child soldiers, the prevention of the use of child soldiers, and the elimination of the weapons platform of child soldiers to have more women in the security forces that are facing them? Thanks.
I'm going to let Shelly give most of the response, except to say that no, the Americans have not signed up, and it'd be worthwhile to give a worthy answer when we are now up to 60 nations in a period of 2.5 months that have signed up to the Vancouver Principles, which are, of which Shelly is the author of, which are essentially the instruments and the guidance of how to train and how to focus security forces in ultimately making child soldiers a relevant capability. And the presence of more women, yes, that is in fact one of the very significant mandates that came out of the Vancouver Ministerial Conference, which is the pledging conference of nations to UN peacekeeping and contributing capabilities to that. So if you would.
Yeah, so no, the U.S. hasn't signed on, although what we recognized was that there are signatories from every continent of the world that have signed on to the Vancouver Principles. And I think some would really shock a lot of people who it is that has signed on. However, the argument that I was told, and this comes out of the UN ambassador's office or the US ambassador to the UN's office, because that's where the level of that advocacy was at that time for the signatories, was at the level of the UN. The response was, well, we haven't signed on to the Convention of the Rights of the Child or the Paris Principles, so why would we sign this? And so I feel as if there was really not an openness to even really comb through what does this mean and get them to get on board. Because what was interesting is with some pressure from our government and our chief of defense staff, the UK signed on. And the UK has some age issues, much like the United States and Canada also, right, in terms of the 0 under 18 approach. So I think that it's part of a conversation that should get opened up to really talk to the government at the senior level about what is it that was requiring you to do is actually in line with your own best interest, right? On the women peace and security front, one of the elements of the Vancouver Principles is exactly that. It talks about the need for us to understand that inclusion of women in peacekeeping and as security sector actors has a unique element that we need to understand better and advocate for better, that it can be a critical element to also addressing the prevention of the use of child soldiers. So we tend to link increasing women to increasing understandings on gender, but we also need to understand that there is an element there that can definitely help with the promotion of the prevention of the recruitment and use of child soldiers. And so, just as a quick side note for you, I give an example of being in the Congo and meeting with military observers and asking a male military observer at that time, is there any difference in the way that you do your job and the way that your female counterparts do their job when it comes to reporting and looking at the issue of children in armed conflict? His response to me was, of course not. There's no difference whatsoever. We're all professionals. We all do the job the same. Well, one of only 6 female military observers then walked past the room, and I said, do you mind if I go interview her when I'm finished with you? And he said, oh, absolutely. I sat down with her and I asked her the same question, and her response was, oh, there's loads of difference in the way that we do our job, and talked about it. So I just even think from an intelligence gathering perspective and from seeing the situation differently, that there's a lot of information that we aren't capturing and utilizing that could be really beneficial on that side of things.
Here in the front and then across and then back.
First of all, thank you all. Extremely illuminating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an NGO called Global Peace Services USA. And in our latest newsletter of January 2018, we have an interview with Dr. Mike Wessels at Columbia University, who is an expert on child soldiers. And I commend that interview to you. It's up on the web, globalpeaceservicesusa.org. My question is this: the issue of the impetus for parents to encourage their children to join a militia, the children's situation on their own, and here we get into the issue of development, foreign assistance, and the quality of life that these young people have. I see that Shelly, if I could call you that, has worked on these issues before. And I realize there are a lot of factors at play, but this is certainly one. So I'd like some thoughts about that. And again, when young people come back to a destroyed economy, what options are there? The rebuilding of the economic sectors, the educational sectors. There needs to be some solid ground under their feet. Otherwise, some food, modest though it is in a militia, a sense of camaraderie in death, albeit, is attractive. It's a bond. It's a coming together. How can we find some options here?
Thank you. Do you want to take that one to start, Joe?
Sure. In my work at Human Rights Watch, I've done quite a number of investigations of the recruitment and use of child soldiers, so I've had the opportunity to interview children in conflicts like Nepal, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and elsewhere. And part of the question is, how did you end up to be in this armed group or this armed force? And you have a whole continuum. You know, there are certainly children who have no choice. They're abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army or, you know, basically forced at gunpoint to join. I've interviewed other children who are subject to subtle forms of coercion, sometimes not so subtle. For example, in Burma, recruiters will often just accost young boys on the street and use deception to say that if they don't have the proper identity card, for example, they'll have to go to jail. Well, if they don't want to go to jail, they can join the army instead. And it's absolutely not true, but the kids don't know that. They're too young, and it's a way for the recruiters to meet their recruitment quotas. In Sri Lanka, we found that the Tamil Tigers would really use Tamil nationalism, and they would go house to house telling families that it's your duty as a Tamil to give a child for the cause, and if you don't do it, you're not a real Tamil, and you don't care about your community. And if you don't do it by by choice, we'll come and take a child by force. Another element that we found is that an important element is whether the child has experienced grievances by government forces. We found a number of cases, I can think of cases in Nepal or Sri Lanka or in India, where children will say, well, the government forces, they attacked my village, they killed my mother, they shot my father, and they joined armed groups for revenge, because they want to get back at those that they perceive as having hurt their families and their communities. So, there's a whole range of factors. And sometimes, kids join with the awareness of their parents, sometimes encouragement, sometimes they make their own decision or the parents have no part in the decision. But your point, too, about, what is available for them afterwards is really key. And, we heard about the recycling of child soldiers, children being re-recruited, and one of the reasons why that happens is if children don't have the chance to return to school or if they don't have viable vocational options once they get out. They want to be able to support themselves. They want to be able to, be part of civilian society, and if they can't do that, it may be a real temptation to go back into soldiering. So having opportunities available and really looking at those rehabilitation and reintegration options is definitely key, one of the real elements that we have to pay attention to.
And that goes back to Dwight's point about planning. It's planning before the deployments, during the deployments, after. If you don't start your planning for what to do with the demobilized child soldiers that you've secured through these action plans until after they've been demobilized, you're already too late. We have a question up front here.
May I just add one point? It's that all the examples that Joe has presented, there's not one of them that really says that the child was a volunteer. Because the child's caught up under duress, is caught up in a conflict, and is caught up by an acceptance of the fact that we'll use the child. And that they'll be used for a variety of it. Be just carry water or carry ammunition or actually be a combatant. And it's that framework that we are pushing our work is to change the ethos of military forces, security forces regarding the children, but also influencing the national construct in regards to the fact that children they do not participate in adult wars. It's fundamentally a morally corrupt and ethically unacceptable framework.
Rachel,
Yes,
could
of
I
course.
also a lot of times there's a discussion or debate about whether the protection of civilians is strictly limited to protection against physical violence, or is it expanded to other things that might be better categorized in the stability realm, like rule of law and good governance and economic sustainability and social well-being. And in our doctrine and in our approach, we say, these other things are factors in the protection of civilians. That protection of civilians, you just can't say, well, we're going to stop all the physical violence today, and hey, we've done that, and now our protection of civilians task is done. Because if you don't address these other issues, then you're going to have the same conflict next Thursday, or the same issues next Thursday, or worse conflicts next Thursday as the grievances erupt because these issues aren't being addressed. And so a lot of times with protection of civilians, we are talking about things that are going to take a long time to institutionalize and put in place in order to implant, sometimes requiring a cultural change amongst the people who are affected. And I'm reminded of this one four-pronged framework that if you want to change a culture, like change a culture on child soldiers, for example, there's kind of four things that are maybe that are essential, maybe not sufficient, but they're essential. And one is to have the laws or the policy in effect. to have institutions in effect is the second one. That the public discourse supports the effort that you're trying to implement, and that, that's what's said on the blog sites, it's what's said by the leaders at the national and local levels, and then finally education. And and if you have those four prongs going in the right direction, cultural change in a bad culture can be
Effective.
it might have a chance of occurring. If those four prongs are going in the wrong direction, certainly then there are matters of concern. And the other thing I'd also suggest as an area to consider is the linkages between the issue of human trafficking and child soldiers. That there may be some parallels there, and sometimes the child is coughed up to human traffickers against his or her will because the parents have reasons to do that. Same for being a child soldiers. The perpetrators or the enablers of those types of networks, there may be some similarities. The ways of dealing with them, maybe there are some similarities as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And I recognize we're running a little bit short on time, so.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Cornelia Weiss, General Dallaire. This is a great honor that you're here. I got to know about you in 2011 when I was in War College. Brent Beardsley came down for a 2-week session on peace ops, and it was the best 2 weeks of my life. So thank you very much.
Well, you worked with us.
So General Dallaire and Dr. Whitman, I'm curious as to the scenario training that you all engage in, recognizing that we seem to waffle whether child soldiers are civilians or combatants, and if you are in that situation and in the situation of needing self-defense or defense of others without killing them or without hurting them, I mean, however you want to phrase this, what kind of scenario training are you doing so that we don't get into the whole morass of issues? Thank you.
I'd let Dr. Whitman talk about the 12 constructs that we use, but just make one point is that we do recognize that there will be some children who will end up being killed. That there are situations where, from self-defense to the nature of where they're engaged, that there will be children. So we're not in this absolutism that is irresponsible to take in regards to conflict where children will not be. No, some will fall victim. But the question is that there are many other options than simply doing that, and that's essentially what the whole construct of training and preparation is.
Sure. So in terms of the scenario training, yes, he's right. We have currently 12 specific interactions we walk through, and they can be combined together. They can be infused in larger scenarios that exist, the exercises that may be taking place. You can infuse 1, 2, 5 like this and give context to seeing children in these specific instances. Now, when we do this, we have interaction charts, and we walk through this in a classroom setting first, and we'll look through some of the key considerations that you have to know and understand. And in terms of the key considerations, what we always want everybody to understand is we're not prescriptive. It's not that A plus B equals C, but you have to understand that these are some key elements you want to be aware of, understand the context, the background to this before you even get to that situation. So all of those things, like understanding why children are recruited, how they're recruited, where they're recruited, all of these elements have to be brought in. And issues like, yes, understanding child trafficking and child labor and the connections, those are all things we talk about to give a basis before you even get to the scenarios and the interaction charts that we work on. And when we do those, we then go into field simulation exercises where we go out and we test whether or not you've actually embodied the knowledge that we've taught in the classroom. And it's in this is our handbook that we have. This is the 3rd edition of our handbook that we use, which guides our training, and there are other tools that go along with this, like soldier cards or aide-memoire cards that we have that we leave with the soldiers that we train, which give them sets of examples of standard operating procedures, rules of engagement, do's and don'ts, etc. And so we use that, and we walk through those things, and then we will stop along the way and interrupt when things aren't going the way that they should go, because it is quite funny. You know, I'll just say we do training with veterans from the Canadian Armed Forces to become part of our roster of trainers around the world. So because we believe the validity of having those who have that experience combined with those of us that are either from an academic or humanitarian background brings a depth of experience when we conduct training. And we work really hard in the countries that we're in to get those people who are excelled trainers to come with us to other countries to continue to train. But their experience as being people who have had interactions is extremely important in what we are doing. But what I'm saying to you is that even when you put people who have had this experience into that scenario, they freeze because they haven't practiced it. And so we advocate that you've got to practice this at least 9 to 10 times before you face it in the field, right? So that's a little bit of the background about what we try to do, and we try to contextualize it for those instances that we are in. So if we're training troops that are going to go to Somalia or Nigeria, we will understand how is it that you will see children in these contexts. These are the most important scenarios for you to understand. Let's walk through the possibilities of options here. And as the general said, it doesn't take away the fact that you still have self-defense as an inherent right, and that may be the best case scenario that you will have, but at least you will have thought through this. And it's not, did I do the right thing? It's, well, this is what I did with the training that I had, and I did the best that I could. And so from a PTSD perspective, it means when you come back home, you can at least have the knowledge that you did everything you could do in that, as opposed to being, I don't know, or I completely made the wrong choice in that instance.
We were training Sierra Leone forces, preparing trainers as we started to build the capacity, because it's a new capability for their forces to handle this threat. And they had a contingent being prepared to go to Somalia, and the Somalis asked us to participate in that training. It was being led by the British, and so we were able to inject trained trainers, which is a 3-day program, and ultimately a 10-day program. So while we started that, the British said, well, can we sit in and watch what you're doing? And by the end of the first morning, from the corporal up to the colonel came out and said, where were you when we were in Afghanistan? And then they started to question themselves and say, you know, we did this at this time, is that right? We did this at this time, is that right? Mm-hmm. Because they hadn't had any preparatory training before being thrown in and facing that threat. And we don't want that. The surprise is to surprise the enemy, not us. And that's where, in fact, we give a level field for people to be able to look at better options than simply escalating to use of force.
Given the lateness, I want to give our panelists just one last opportunity to make any comments or thoughts that they had before we conclude. So I'll start on this end. Since You're good? Okay. Joe?
I think I'm good too.
Don't you dare ever leave the opportunity. I just want to indicate that the work that we did with the Canadian government, the Canadian forces, started with the Canadian forces and their training and doctrine group, and the awareness that this was something that, although they were facing it, had not considered it as a specific threat, a specific problem that needed very specific capabilities to build their force and to give them more operational effectiveness. It was never perceived as that. And once we got the military to see that that was an operational capability that they required to be more effective and to reduce casualties on their own side, let alone the casualties on the children's side, then that moved the whole premise. And with the political desire to join in resolution, UN Resolution 1612 and children in armed conflict and the protection of civilians and specifically protection of children, we got the political will to want to make sure that our forces were able to lead and to take a leadership role in that. And so we're thankful from that framework to be able now to move with the Vancouver Principles globally. It's there. We're working on a guidance, capability of a guidance instrument to help nations build their doctrines and their training capabilities and so on. Thank you.
At the risk of me talking after him, because technically you will watch and he'll usually want to talk after me so that he's the last one.
Yeah, I know.
Just quickly to say, I just wanted to pick up on the detention issue that both Joe and the Colonel had talked about, is that you mentioned about, reasons why children join, etc., and grievances. Joe talked about. We were in Nigeria in October, and we went to the northeast in Maiduguri, and we met with Nigerian forces, and we met with children who had just come out of Boko Haram. And we had an opportunity in Nigeria to also have a 3-hour executive brief that I could give to senior officers there. And one of the things that I talked to them about is that if you don't handle the children that are coming out of those contexts in a more appropriate manner, all you're doing is driving recruitment for the extremists. And so from that perspective, I'd just like to put that out there to all of you, that you have to think from that perspective, especially with young people, because they are driven far more by emotion than rational thinking, because that's how their brains operate, okay? And so if we don't address those elements and take away that flame from the fuel to the fire, then we're not going to address this issue. And that's why it's so important to have troops around the world addressing how to interact with children more appropriately from all of these dynamics. Thank you.
So fast.
Well, I get the moderator's prerogative of speaking last. So I do think that this conversation raises the issue that this isn't just a child protection issue. This is an issue that protects our own troops as well, and our own policies, and the longevity of the pieces that we are trying to create and to be part of. And so, I don't think you're going to come across people who say, yay, child soldiers are good. But we have to change that thinking to say, and here's why child soldiers are not just not good, but that why they affect our long-term security, our long-term stability. And until we're able to change the conversation to be more than just sort of, yes, this is a terrible and tragic practice, we're not going to make those inroads into stopping this as a global phenomenon, and we're not going to have the long-lasting pieces that I think so many of us are interested in seeing. And so with that, stay tuned for further discussions on this topic, because the conversation is not over. We're not really just beginning, we're sort of in the middle.
Right.
And I hope that this is leading us to a successful end. So thank you all for coming, for braving the weather. It still looks like it's okay. I know our panelists have long distances to get home, and so I wish all of you very safe travels, and thanks to you watching at home, and watch this space for more discussion. So thank you.